This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by N+1 Magazine, which publishes some of the most urgent political writing, essays, and cultural criticism on the left today. One new piece that might be of interest to Dig listeners is William Harris's Acid Rhythms, out now in the magazine's latest issue. Harris, who has written for N+1 on everything from anti-colonial cinema to basketball, follows the evolution of Detroit's music scene in the 1960s and 70s. Surveying the rise and fall of a multiracial movement in Detroit's streets, nightclubs, and auto factories, Harris argues that the city's diverse musical cultures and countercultures not only reflected the street-level politics of deindustrialization, but expressed the era's most revolutionary possibilities, too. Dig listeners can take 25% off a subscription to N+1 at n+1mag.com/thedig. Enter The Dig, one word, at checkout to get 3 issues delivered in the mail, plus access to 20 years of paywalled writing for less than $3 a month. That's n+1mag.com/thedig. Enter The Dig, one word, at checkout. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denvir, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. I was just quoted in a Guardian article about The Dig, describing our listeners as, quote, overwhelmingly sharp, interesting people committed to doing important work to transform the world, all over the world. What do they need to know? I'm trying to map out the terrain. Today, we continue our mission to survey territory that, at least for me, is mostly uncharted, addressing 2 subjects that you haven't heard much about before on this podcast: disability and animal liberation. And it's not just The Dig. Why is it that these subjects are not more integral to left-wing and Marxist politics in general? That is one of many good questions that my guest host, Astra Taylor, asks Sunaura Taylor, who is also Astra's sister. Every year, humans kill 80 billion land animals and an even larger number of fish for food. But industrialized animal agriculture isn't just horrible for the creatures it commodifies. It also endangers humanity. Big meat emits an estimated 14 to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions, devours more than 1/3 of the planet's habitable land, fuels antibiotic resistance, and increases the risk of future pandemics, exploits vulnerable workers, and concentrates corporate profits. Animal rights activism, then, touches on many issues that the left cares about, but it's often regarded as a fringe issue rather than a potential cornerstone of a transformative socialist agenda. In her book Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation, Sunaura Taylor reframes the debate about animal exploitation and offers new ways of conceptualizing our relationships to animals that challenge standard assumptions and frameworks. From the speciesist faith in human superiority to Peter Singer's utilitarianism. She and Astra co-authored the essay Our Animals, Ourselves for Lux magazine, which makes the socialist feminist case for expanding our circle of concern to other species. And one last thing, I know these sorts of conversations can be touchy because they touch on diet, what we eat. I think of myself as a veggie-forward omnivore, meaning I try to mostly eat a plant-based diet, but I'm neither vegetarian nor vegan. I hope that whatever you eat, you, like me, will find this analysis illuminating. Before we get started, please support The Dig at patreon.com/thedig. I'm so grateful that listeners are so committed to this podcast. And one reason I know that you're so committed is because the show is overwhelmingly funded by listeners making voluntary contributions. I say voluntary because we don't paywall shows. You can just sit there listening to everything we've ever put out without donating anything at all. And the reason why we do that is because The Dig is a political education project. We do need to raise funds to cover our operating expenses to keep the lights on, but making money is not the purpose of this show. We are trying to give organizers the world over the analysis you need to help change everything. So please know that it is voluntary contributions from listeners like you that make it all possible. If you can afford to contribute and you haven't done so yet, please make a donation now. Every contributor gets our excellent newsletter by email. Depending on where you live and how much you donate, we will send you books, tote bags, coffee mugs. That's patreon.com/thedig. There is a link in the show notes. Click it. Thanks. And here's Astra Taylor interviewing Sunaura Taylor. Sunaura Taylor is a writer, artist, activist, and academic. She's the author of Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert, and Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation, which received a 2018 American Book Award. Along with academic journals, Taylor has written for a range of popular media outlets, and her artworks have been exhibited internationally. She's a professor in the Division of Society and Environment in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley, and the director of Disabled Ecologies Lab, which aims to envision anti-ableist responses to the most pressing environmental issues of our time. Astra Taylor, alongside being a regular guest host here on The Dig, is a writer, filmmaker, and organizer. She's the director of numerous documentaries, and her books include The Age of Insecurity, Coming Together as Things Fall Apart, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone, and the American Book Award winner, The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. Her most recent book is Solidarity, The Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea, co-written with Leah Hunt Hendricks. She was the 2023 CBC Massey Lecturer, and she co-founded The Debt Collective, a union of debtors.
Sunaura Taylor, welcome to The Dig.
Astra Taylor, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
This is a bit of an unusual interview in that, full disclosure, we're sisters. We're also collaborators. If there's anyone on this planet with whom my own thinking is most aligned and intertwined, it's probably yours. Our work has taken different directions, different forms, and yet I feel it fundamentally comes from a shared experience and also a shared ethical and political framework. We're going to begin this conversation by talking about your amazing book, Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation, which came out in 2017. I do want listeners to know that you actually have a new book out this year called Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert, and maybe we'll have you back on to discuss that. But for now, we're starting with Beasts of Burden. And then toward the end of this conversation, we're going to discuss an article that we actually co-wrote for Lux magazine called Our Animals Ourselves, in which we make a socialist feminist case for animal rights. So that's a map of the conversation for our listeners so they know where we're going. But let's begin with the subtitle of your book, Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation. I think it might be helpful to explain to listeners why these two domains, animal and disability liberation, aren't often thought together before we get into your arguments about why they are actually deeply connected.
So yeah, why are these issues seen as in conflict? You know, I began doing this research, kind of looking at these issues together in around 2006. And I knew that there wasn't a lot of work that was connecting these fields or arenas, But what I was surprised by was the way in which, it goes beyond that. They were actually really seen as in conflict, as in tension with each other. And for me, as a disabled person who, grew up as a vegetarian, had always, been interested in animal issues, this seems so strange, because to me, it just seemed obvious that they should be in conversation with each other. So I kind of did, started it piqued my curiosity, and I really dove into these, the reasons for why this might be the case. And so the first and, most obvious, but also on some level most challenging, is a history of dehumanization, right? People with disabilities, like so many other marginalized communities, have historically been dehumanized, particularly disabled people of color and people with intellectual disabilities. There's been a long philosophical tradition of linking disability with animality, right? Which wasn't just rhetorical. There were material consequences of justifying the mistreatment, containment, and neglect of disabled people, based on their, quote, animal-like nature. So this history is very complicated, very hurtful, and has been at times, deadly for people. So I think the ways in which animality has been weaponized, both materially and philosophically, can make connecting to animal issues harder. And actually, maybe, with that in mind, I'll just say up front that this book is not, making the case that animals and disabled people are similar, or that we share some sort of similar experience, right? What I'm looking at in this book is how the systems that oppress us are entangled. So how ableism and speciesism are entangled. But to get back to this question, so I think dehumanization is part of it, but also the way in which, animal rights and veganism have kind of been co-opted as a lifestyle choice, right, versus as a political or ethical stance. And that choice has often been framed most often as a choice to be fit or healthy or skinny, right? This sort of glamorous vegan that if you just eat the right vegan diet, you won't be sick, and to boot, you'll be attractive and have an attractive, skinny body or whatever. And this is, of course, a very alienating message to many communities, but particularly to disabled communities. And in part because some of that has often included a kind of body shaming and health shaming. So, there's other reasons. There's tensions around animal research, the fact that some disabled people rely on medications and stuff that have been tested on animals, So, and also that the animal movement has not really done a lot to support or promote disability movements, right? Or even think about access, especially, again, this is 2006 when I'm looking at these things. So, but I would say that actually the main challenge really has been the association of animal rights with Peter Singer. Singer is a philosopher who has long been both considered to be sort of the father of animal rights, but also has been very antagonistic towards disability community. So we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but maybe just to set the stage for why this is such a fraught issue, Singer has advocated, that disabled lives are less worth living than able-bodied lives, and has advocated that disabled people are not full persons. These are obviously hard arguments for disabled community to want to jump on. There's a lot of nuances, which we'll talk about later, but this is undoubtedly a major point of tension. And you and I both read Animal Liberation as children. So I think, I think we also have an understanding of how impactful and important that work too was. But I also, it was pretty shocking to kind of realize just how much this had an effect on how these two movements were perceived together. So I think that's kind of a general overview of why these movements have been at odds. And, what I really wanted to show in this book is that, far from being at odds, these movements actually have an immense amount to offer each other and actually are really integral to each other.
I should probably confess to the audience, too, that Peter Singer makes an appearance in my film Examine Life, which came out in 2008. You're also in that film taking a walk alongside the philosopher Judith Butler. We have I think it's kind of fair to say a love-hate relationship with Peter Singer. At least that sort of describes my attitude.
Yeah, it's complicated, you know.
So you begin Beasts of Burden by recounting two epiphanies that you had at a young age. One was actually at what was my 7th or 8th birthday party, and another was not long after that when we took a family trip to Washington, D.C. So why don't you begin with those moments, since that's how you start the book, and explain why they were so significant.
I realized really early on in this research just how tricky and delicate these issues would be. You know, when I told people early on that I was writing a book about this, people in disability community were often kind of like, "Oh, that sounds, like a challenging thing to do," right? So, I think I took it on very early that if I was going to write this book, I would have to take personal risks and really root what I was saying and how I was getting to these ideas in my own experience and story and positionality. This is not the easiest thing. It's challenging to tell personal narratives of disability that don't fall into a variety of, stereotypes of narrative traps of the way in which disability is often talked about. Right? These personal stories can be so often overly focused on, which then can draw attention away from the political dynamics at play. At the same time, though, the experience of marginalization and difference, of course, offers a really important and profound vantage point from which to make connections and ask questions. And just as a reminder, right, that the personal is always political. So Beasts of Burden really utilizes my story and lens as a method to kind of get to these broader theoretical questions. And in fact, that's really like a method that I utilize across my body of work. So with that kind of like put out there, I will tell these two stories that I start the book with. So the first one is, yes, at your like 7th or 8th birthday. It was the mid 80s, maybe I guess like late 80s, actually, I should say. We were listening to Madonna. I think in my memory, it was Madonna's True Blue. And
I think that's right.
And we were all dancing. We were just having a really good time. And I remember, standing, wiggling around, doing some dance, and then falling. And then getting up again, dancing again, and then falling again. And just thinking like, oh, I'm just like too excited. I really want to dance. And then, by the 3rd or 4th fall, I just had this like epiphany of like, oh, that is what disability, or in the language of that era, like that's what handicapped means, right? And it was just the first memory of viscerally kind of understanding that there was something different about my embodiment. So I share that story, and then I move ahead a few years, probably to the early 90s or so. You might have a better timeline of this than I do, but we were on some sort of family vacation. In my memory, it was to DC, and we came across I don't know whether it was, PETA or some other animal rights organization that had a bunch of literature. And, in my memory, it was you and our brother Alex and I, and we, came away from that table just transformed. Like, what meat is animals? How could no one have told us this? This is like, a complete alteration of how I made sense of the world, right? Like, I thought that I understood what categories things belonged to, right? Animals were in one category, food was in another category. How could these things be crossing over? And also just how could there be such cruelty that was just like accepted on a day-to-day level, right? And all of this kind of, coming through the lens of like a 6-year-old or whatever I was. So I tell these stories for a few reasons. One, because I know that from that very first realization of, that animals, that meat is animals, that I also knew that there was a community of people fighting against animal exploitation, right? And I had no idea that there was such a thing as the disability movement for years and years, right? It was really this sort of visceral experience of difference that didn't give me any sense that there was a whole community of people out there, right? Or that there were other political ways of understanding disability. But I also tell it because, that visceral sense of difference, that's not something that, can linger with someone necessarily, or at least it didn't with me. And so the sort of difficulty or suffering, if you want to use that term, in that moment of realization really was nothing compared to the experiences I began to feel because of ableism, right? Even in our radical household, where, I was certainly not treated badly, right? But the ableism kind of creeped its way into our worlds, right? I understood that society was not built for bodies of mine, like mine, that there were, no other disabled people that I could see in positions of success or power or happiness even, it was just, right, that there were such low expectations, not from our family, but from just the ableist atmosphere of society. I think these two epiphanies, right? One of what it means to be a body and a person who is marginalized and excluded, and then the other of what it means to awaken to cruelty. These are the questions that, I had when I was 6, but that just lingered. And ultimately, that's what this book is sort of exploring.
Yeah, hearing you say that, one, it makes me imagine a world where you came upon a booth that also had information about the history of disability rights organizing, right? So that you could have had that epiphany.
Right. Yeah, that could have been
earlier.
Yeah, a totally different reality, possibly.
But also, when you reflect on these epiphanies from your early years, it makes me remember one of my favorite quotes from the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who is not one of my favorite thinkers, but he said that philosophers are adults who persist in asking childish questions. And I think we both have remained pretty loyal to these big questions that we asked as kids, and we insist on still asking them today. And I think that your book is a real tribute to that. I think all of our books and all of our projects actually are. But continue the story, because you do, obviously that's just where you kick things off. Could you talk about coming into political awareness, finding disability community, finding disability politics? What happened?
Yeah, so I was a child of the 80s and 90s in Georgia. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, for reference, passed in 1990 when I was 8. And so of course it would take years for that legislation to really, structurally begin altering reality, as imperfect as it is.
By which you just mean ramps,
right,
or other
ramps,
basic forms of access.
The fact that I can now go and use a bathroom, there's accessible toilets, there's accessible, all these different kind of things that.
Accessible rides at theme parks.
Exactly. That would have, that was unheard of in my, as a child. So, right. So there was no sign of disability community to me in our reality. And then, when I would sort of watch the, television or hear the radio or something, there was no sense of there's a community of disabled people organizing. And it also wasn't a part of a conversation of other activist arenas that we, and our parents kind of circulated in. So thankfully, when I was around 18, I believe I was around 18, I was how do I do this? How do I live as a disabled person? How do I make this transition from being a kid to also moving out or doing all the things that people do as an 18-year-old, And so I searched on the internet. I think I literally searched how do people, I don't know what I searched, but it was something disability and survival, disability in politics, something. And by some lucky series of events, I stumbled upon this article that was written in 2002 by Marta Russell and Ravi Malhotra called Capitalism and Disability. And I'm just going to read a little brief section of this article because it was if I had to find one thing, this was the universe being here, this is exactly the thing that you are on some level unconsciously hoping exists. So They write, "We take the view that disability is a socially created category derived from labor relations, a product of the exploitative economic structure of capitalist society, one which creates and then oppresses the so-called disabled body as one of the conditions that allows the capitalist class to accumulate wealth." Okay, so I was just like, disability, a socially created category derived from labor relations and capitalism? Like, this is totally, utterly transforming my world, because I was, again, like a young person trying to figure out how to live on my own, wondering if I would ever get a job, wondering whether I would, ever not be on SSI, or what my worth was, right? If I wasn't a productive, quote unquote, productive person. And so this article just instantly transformed my way of thinking about so many issues, but my way of thinking about disability. And then luckily from that, and again, I don't know how this, kind of magically happened, but I found that there was a protest march by the group ADAPT, which at the time and today is still American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today. It originally was actually American Disabled for Public Transit, for accessible public transit, excuse me. And so I had no idea who this group was. I was just like, I'm going to join this protest march. I think it was 144 miles from, from Philadelphia to DC. Took like 2 weeks. I'd never really hung out with disabled people, let alone like being in disability community. And so this was like a sink or swim kind of thing. And it was, again, just very transformative. So this group, ADAPT, actually, again, I didn't really know, honestly, at the time, but was one of, for 40 years has been doing really powerful direct action. They basically are responsible for making our buses accessible. I think we just hit the anniversary of one of their early actions where people, like, I think it was the very late 70s, where people got out of their chairs and into, and slept in front of like the busiest bus intersection in Denver, I think it was, right? So they fought for accessible transit, and then what they were fighting for while I was on this march with them was for deinstitutionalization, for disabled people to not be kind of funneled into nursing homes, but instead to have the access and the means to live in their own communities with attendants. So I learned this whole long history of disability organizing, right? That actually at that, time when I was looking at the animal rights literature when I was a kid, that there was amazing disability activism going on. I just didn't know about it, right? But I also learned all these various ways of being in disability community, right? These other kinds of values that I would say emerge from spaces where disabled people are able to be together. Values of interdependence, of not having shame for asking for help, of mutual care, of vulnerability, and also fundamentally that disability is a political issue. So those were like the things that I took away from that. But, I'll say that one other thing that I took away was that, the left actually, despite the fact that the first article I found was on disability and capitalism, that the left wasn't really interested in disability. I was kind of disappointed and surprised to realize that actually there was no coverage of the march or of what was happening in left media. Not that there was very much in just general media in general, right? But so I actually wrote my first article with your encouragement for the monthly review, I think about 2 years later, which was called "The Right Not to Work, Power and Disability."
Yeah, and I actually wrote the one piece in Left Media about the march was actually my very first ever article in The Nation, because I came and saw you at the tail end of the march. We should recommend to listeners that they read Marta Russell. In fact, Haymarket recently put out a collection of her essays called "Capitalism and Disability." That's the name of the collection. And just an absolute legend, and would have been an amazing guest on the Dig if she was still alive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what is disability? That's the next question. It's the title of an early chapter, and it's an important question because it's, like all good ones, it's not entirely self-evident what the answer is. So if you could talk about different ways of understanding disability, I'm going to quote you here briefly. You write that, quote, disability is not only a lived experience that shapes individual human lives, it is also an ideology that plays a central role in forming our histories, politics, and cultures. What do you mean by that, and what are some of the implications?
Okay, I'm going to do my best here. This is a huge question. This is like why the field of disability studies exists, is to partially explore what is this? What is disability? But maybe I'll start by saying that one of the misconceptions about disability is that it is only relevant, right, or of interest to those of us who have an obvious disability, like, using a wheelchair or blindness. But disability is a life experience and political issue that impacts everyone. If we live long enough, we all age into disability. We all move in and out of disability and illness throughout our lives, right? So there is no simple binary between disability and able-bodiedness. These categories are extremely murky and also, are redefined across all sorts of different legal definitions. They vary across different, wherever you're looking, right? So disability, is essentially, like other categories of difference, is not some biological state, just some personal medical problem, right? But it is a category that is shaped by historical, political, social, and relational dynamics. Like gender and class and race, disability is a social force that affects the world in a really pervasive manner, right? So it's not just a lived experience, it is a concept that, again, is really powerful. And so we can look, for example, thinking about Marta Russell's work, that ideologies of disability have been central to the development of the modern world. Scholars have exposed the role of disability in the creation of capitalism and labor relations, particularly in contributing to definitions of a work-based system versus a needs-based system of distribution, but also as well as in concepts and definitions of things like, independence, efficiency, and productivity.
Right. And those are certainly concepts that affect able-bodied people, right?
Absolutely, right? So again, it's not these are concepts that are not just sort of targeting, but particular bodies that are different or impaired or injured or whatever. They shape able-bodied people's reality as well. So another example is just how disability has been really key to formulating U.S. immigration policies, right? How disability has sort of been used to justify the exclusion of various racialized and class population through stereotypes of people, as posing a public health threat or as sort of likely to be a public charge and stuff. And then also it's of course really important to mention that disability is also inseparable from the emergence of other categories or taxonomies of difference, right? Including the very concept of the human. The segmenting of beings and the natural world into novel categories signifying varying degrees of exploitability was in part a project rooted in ranking and ordering different capacities and states of being. So again, disability and able-bodiedness shape our worlds. And what actually all of my work is really interested in examining is how these concepts, disability, able-bodiedness, ableism, really shape not only the human world, right, but actually our understanding of non-human animals and nature more broadly. So sort of disability beyond the human, or disability as a lens through which to understand multi-species worlds. There's so much to say, but maybe, one last thing that I want to touch on is just that, I think one of the really important things that critical disability perspectives have shown for decades is that disability and, again, these related concepts, including health and illness, are really powerful, malleable concepts that, when left unmarked and depoliticized, can be wielded and deployed in a variety of ways for a variety of ends. Some of which may be liberatory, but some of which may be like extremely exclusionary or eugenic. So I think it becomes really important to be able to see where narratives of disability are being utilized and for what ends, right? As we saw, just with the immigration example, right? Because these concepts are so naturalized that they're used as alibis to cover up inequality. And I think, a really obvious example is just what we saw with COVID, right? A devaluing of disabled people, but also a sort of naturalizing of the deaths of those who, had pre-existing conditions, often in order specifically to evade the reality of exploitation and racism as the sort of actual real death traps, right? So what Beasts of Burden, tries to do is analyze how the power structures and ideologies that shape and justify animal exploitation rely on ableist assumptions and ideas about disability. So again, I'm trying to or utilize all of this amazing scholarship and work that has been done to really understand disability, to think about how that actually shapes our understanding of animals and nature more broadly.
Yeah. I mean, just to reiterate the point you just made, but your point is it's like a real devil's bargain for able-bodied people to be like, well, it's only sick people who are dying of COVID, because ultimately you're reinforcing a system that doesn't care for any form of life. And what you're saying is this impacts animals as well. So I promise we are going to get to animals, because that is really the kind of heart and soul of your book. But just one question before. One thing I really appreciate about both of your books is that they don't shy away from complexity. Towards the end of Beasts of Burden, you pose what I think is a really profound question, and one that you grapple with in Disabled Ecologies. You write, quote, "How can we criticize the systems that lead to disability while simultaneously allowing disabled people to experience their bodies in empowered ways, or at least in ways that are not defined by oppression, discrimination, and the able-bodied world?" So, please say more on that, and how, maybe reflect on how this question has reverberated through your life. Where do you see it reverberating today?
Yeah. It is definitely the sort of question that I think my work is perpetually obsessed with. It is what I've kind of come to see as like the paradox of disability, that it can be both of those things.
Both of those things meaning?
Like that it can be something that emerges from profound exploitation and profound violence, right? The worst things, war, and yet disability can also be community, be a site of creating these alternative values that I talked about earlier, right? It can be creative, it can be generative, and for me, this tension or I think paradox really emerged from me, to go back to, again, my own personal story and narrative, right? I was raised, as with the understanding that my disability was caused by defense industry pollution in Tucson, Arizona. It's actually the subject, the contamination, the defense industry contamination and the amazing movement that emerged from it are actually the subject of my new book, Disabled Ecologies. But this narrative, having that origin story, right, did give me a sense of disability as a political issue. It really framed my understanding of disability. So as much as I didn't have an understanding of disability as political in the way that it's talked about in disability studies or in activist circles, right? I didn't have a sense that there were people fighting for access or disability, or challenging ableism. But I had a sense from the, earliest age that disability is political, is relational, right? That it wasn't just me, that it wasn't my personal problem, that it was a political dynamic that impacted a whole community, that disability emerges, again, from war, from environmental racism, from pollution. I think having that understanding, has helped me kind of hold this dual understanding of what disability is, right? Because then, by the time I discovered disability community, right, I already had a sense that disability was political, but how to kind of really hold both of these realities at the same time has been something that I've had to really think through and work through. And, it's definitely, a central aspect of again, my new book, but also Beasts of Burden. And maybe I'll just say, that a scholar who's been really helpful to me in thinking through this question is one of my favorite scholars, Nirmala Aravelis, whose a book, I believe it came out in 2011, Disability and Difference in Global Contexts, really specifically addresses this question. So Aravelis argues that in the context of colonialism and racial capitalism, that disability operates less as a identity, as a static category of identity, as a descriptor of what someone is, and more as a process, an ongoing event that captures the materiality of racialized violence under the demands of capital. And Aravelis asks a really important question that has really shaped my thinking. She asks, under what conditions might we welcome disability, right? So we have to think about the conditions from which disability is emerging from before and also in order to come to a different place of understanding with disability where it might be able to also be something else. And she says that, suggests that for disability perspectives to be generative, they must, address the conditions that cause so much disablement. So maybe to just kind of touch on why or how these questions are really important to Beast's burden in this conversation, right, is that on the one hand, we have this need to challenge ableist stereotypes, right, the negative valuations of what disability is, and in part because they are utilized to justify exploitation of non-human animals. So we have to challenge these negative valuations about disability. But then on the other hand, right, we have this extraordinary mass disablement of non-human animals that emerges under the context of capitalism, right? And so how, a part of Beast of Burden is kind of holding those two dynamics as well.
Okay, so let's get into this animal question. In your book, you explore the way ableism affects non-human animals on multiple levels, from the way that capitalism disables animal bodies. It's clear that capitalism disables human bodies, whether repetitive stress injuries on the job or look at the situation happening in Gaza. I know that's something that you've thought a lot about, the mass disablement happening there. But you also look at this assignment of value, as you just said. And the point really is that we need to challenge the way things are valued. We need to revalue things. And you approach these interconnected ideas through a story, which is what you do over and over again. You tell the story of a disabled fox. Could you tell it here? It's sort of a portal into thinking about the way ableism affects wild creatures. And it's a prelude to talking about how ableism affects domesticated creatures.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, the fox. So this book really is centrally arguing that ableism is, again, a system of oppression that is entangled with speciesism.
You might need to define speciesism really quickly.
Yeah. Oh my God. How to define? I mean, I guess, right? Human exceptionalism, the idea that humans are somehow above and superior to all other creatures, and that then gives us, all sorts of justifications for whatever we want to do to them. That is how I would define a speciesism in this moment. So I'm interested in how ableism shapes both how we perceive non-human animals, right, but also how we treat non-human animals. And so maybe, as you've kind of pointed to, a good way of getting into these conversations is to look at animals who are disabled themselves, right? And this fox story is one of those. I'll say really quickly first, before I go into the fox, that I think all of this work actually really began when I first realized that other animals can have my disability, arthrogryposis. And I just found this fascinating, right? Arthrogryposis is found pretty regularly on factory farms. In cows, it's called curly calf, which is absurdly cute for then something that is, destroyed because it's a risk to profit, But so I was fascinated by the fact that other animals can have my disability, as an aside. So I found this story of a fox with arthrogryposis. It was in a Canadian newspaper, and it basically described that a local resident saw a fox who seemed to be walking abnormally, had an abnormal gait, and they thought maybe they were sick. And so this resident shot the fox. And on examination, they found that the newspaper detailed that on examination, they found that actually the fox had really, good muscle mass, had, many partially digested smaller mammals in their digestive system. So the fox was essentially living their lives doing well, right? But there was this idea that this fox must be sick. And in fact, it was seen, right, kind of as a mercy killing, right? That this person was putting this injured creature out of its misery, right? A mercy killing, but then also potential fear, right? That this person assumed the fox was sick and potentially, had a contagious disease. So, of course, this person obviously had a gun. So a hunter would have shot a fox for all sorts of less altruistic reasons. But these were kind of the reasons that were presented here. And what I found really interesting about this story is the way that two of the most sort of prominent narratives of disability, right, destruction and pity, were projected onto this fox that was just, who was just kind of going about living his daily life, right? And who was obviously doing a pretty good job of living his life. So this story and many, many, many others that I nerded out finding really made me start thinking about the way that we just project all sorts of shit onto animals, right? All sorts of ideas about gender, about race, about sexuality, right? And about disability. So there's this assumption that disabled animals don't belong in the wild, that nature will run her course, that animals, are competitive and nasty and are just going to, like, if there's a wounded creature or a disabled creature, that creature won't have a chance because, they're just going to be abandoned or eaten or whatever. But so I just ask, how true is this, right? Like, what is us projecting our perceptions and stereotypes of what we think disability is and what we think disability will lead to, and then what is actually happening. So, after kind of really delving into this, I love reading about animal behavior, about the study of animals and how they live, how they think. It's clear to me that this is absolutely not always the case, right? Like, injury happens all the time. Disablement happens all the time. And so animals of a variety of species have to figure out ways of living with it, of making it work, right? And there's countless examples of animals doing this. I tell this one story of this snow monkey, Mozu, who had limb disabilities and who everyone thought was, not going to make it past infancy, but who, lived for, I think, 30 years, became a parent and a grandparent, right? So there's all of these examples, actually. And to me, what's happening is that ableism stops us from actually being able to understand how non-human animals are experiencing disability and injury and what kinds of relationships are developing around that. And so, in other words, it produces bad science. Like, it stops us from asking questions that I think would be really important to ask. I was kind of shocked by just this sort of ableist hoops that animal behaviorists will throw themselves through to explain why some disabled wild animal is, like, still alive, or why other animals are being, kind to them. So when we project human categories of difference, when we project our own sort of stereotypes and prejudices about whether it's gender or, against sexuality or race or disability onto animals, it stops us from actually being able to do good research. And I think that that's really changing. There's a lot of great work over the past few decades that are, really challenging the way that we understand, gender dynamics, or again, the multitude of genders and sexualities or within animal species, right? Like, there's a lot of great work that's really, like, diving into this. And I think that disability is an area that is still quite understudied, and that I would love to see more work kind of being done in. Because I'll add too that I think when these stories are kind of taken up, they're not taken up seriously, right? Like stories of animals, of disabled animals surviving, or of animals helping another disabled animals. These are the things of memes, of viral stories on the internet, right? They're not the things that are taken seriously as like, what can this actually teach us or show us? What can we learn about the way that individual creatures adapt to change, the way that they learn new things, the way that they relate to each other, what does it teach us about animal empathy, right? There's all these big questions that animal behaviorists love to ask that could be asked in these situations, and they're not. So I'm obviously very nerdy about this stuff. This is partially what I teach. So I love thinking through, the ways in which our own kind of assumptions and biases get in the way of us understanding animals, which is all the more strange when we think about just how much power the whole idea of like not being anthropomorphic has been, right? That is like the number one rule for those who, study animals, engage with animals, don't be anthropomorphic, right? But that, I think, has actually stopped us from actually seeing how we are constantly projecting our own power relations onto other creatures.
Right, the whole myth of survival of the fittest, right? Which then, of course, is appropriated to justify all sorts of economic and social hierarchies and systems of exploitation.
I think maybe the last thing that I'll say is that I find this really important because the experience of disablement is, again, important and critical for asking all sorts of questions about non-human animals, right? But one of the reasons why is because scientists and philosophers really focus so much on animal behaviors on a species level, right? Animals always get kind of written down to the terms of what's the species norm. And disability is or can be an individualizing experience, right? And so there's something that I think is important about that disability sort of interrupts this focus on the species level, and could kind of interrupt this really, I think, very damaging habit of only seeing animals at that level, instead of at a variety of other, as community members, as friends, as members of, society, as, maybe citizens of their society, and also as individuals, right? And I think those are kind of the questions that we could get to if we looked at disability in a different kind of way. I want to say here that also, like, throughout this whole conversation, the word animal is just so kind of profoundly frustrating and inadequate, right? It's like we get to be human beings, and then all other creatures as diverse as mosquitoes and orangutans and pigeons, right? They're all lumped into this one word. And so I just want to bring that up here as a major limitation of trying to talk about these things. And that's very purposeful, right? That's part of the hierarchy. We get to be humans. They're all animals, right?
And this point you're making about, breaking out the species and seeing animals as individuals, again, it's like, is that anthropomorphizing? That's the thing we're not supposed to do. But we inherently do project, as you said, project our shit onto animals. And what seeing animals as individuals allows us to do is to see them as persons, which is a legal term, right? In our legal framework right now, animals are rightsless beings. They are things. They are objects. They are property. And part of changing our language is pushing back on that. I mean, because that is, they're something worse than animals in a lot of cases, right? They're possessions, things that have no legal rights, legal beings that have no legal rights in our framework.
Right. And in fact, if I can, that it's also that is partially why being compared to an animal is so scary, right? That's right. Because an animal isn't a being that is a person. An animal isn't a being that has any sort of legal rights. An animal is a possession, is an object. And so I think that also is part of the violence of dehumanization and animalization.
Right. Or to be called human animals, as Palestinians were recently called, right? I mean, animalization is dehumanization. And I think that you're right to highlight that's part of why disabled people, I mean, what you're getting at is that's part of why disabled people have been reluctant to embrace a kind of identification with animal liberation, as you're arguing they should do in this book.
I'm Naomi Klein, and you're listening to The Dig, my go-to podcast for the most thoughtful, in-depth conversation on the left. It's an incredible place to be exposed to new ideas and new writing, and if you can, please become a sustaining supporter at Patreon.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Unite and Win, the Workplace Organizer's Handbook, from EWOC, the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. Since its founding in March 2020 as a joint project of DSA and UE, EWOC has trained and supported thousands of workers who want better working conditions. This brief and accessible organizing guide, based on the collective experience of organizers and workers in non-unionized workplaces, covers the core elements of organizing at work and provides a critical tool to help you and your coworkers organize for justice in your workplace. Find Unite and Win at haymarketbooks.org. If you're interested in placing a bulk order of the handout at a special discount, please write to orders@haymarketbooks.org for more info.
Okay, so we just went over examples of disabled animals in the wild. Now to disabled domesticated creatures. These really are the creatures that are commodities. And this is, I think, one of the most original parts of your book. You know, we're talking here about animals that are bred and slaughtered for profit. A lot of people have probably heard about factory farms, but you do put, I think, a really novel lens onto these industries. So how did you come to understand factory farming in this different way by looking at it through the framework of disability? What happens when we take up that perspective? And how did this create a new sense of kinship for you with commodified creatures?
You know, I mentioned earlier that I discovered that other animals can have my own disability, and that my own, like, that arthrogryposis is something that happens on factory farms, or just in general in the animals that we can utilize for food. You know, so I was interested in that. I was interested in what happens to animals that the industry kind of considers disabled or identifies as, ill or sick. But what I realized really early on is that when I was reading, whether I was reading animal literature or whether I was reading literature from animal industries themselves, sort of describing the lives of these animals, right? Where they live, how they're treated, what their lifespan is, that I was realizing that I was reading about disabled creatures, that all of these creatures, all of these animals in these industries become disabled. And more than that these systems actually profit off of the disablement that they manufacture for these animals to, be essentially good, profitable, efficient products.
Yeah. So give us some examples. What do you mean there?
Animals are literally manufactured to be disabled, and it is, again, fundamentally what drives profit. So they are systematically bred for certain traits, right? We know this. They are bred to their biological limits to produce more meat, more eggs, more milk, right? This breeding, this attempt at turning animals into, efficient machines, efficient producers of these items, has inevitably and invariably consequences for the rest of their bodies. So the industry often refers to a general kind of sense of lameness, that animals become lame. And this can mean that they can't lift their own weight, that their bones are broken, but they use this language of lame. But so these animals literally can't hold up their bodies because their bodies are so heavy from producing, so much meat, or they are made to produce so much milk, right? That they have arthritis, they have osteoporosis, they, not to mention just all of the infections, the udder infections, right? Other animals, pigs, for example, are because of the selective breeding, are extremely prone to stress-induced heart attacks, right? And these environments are profoundly stressful. So, of course, a large number of them end up experiencing that. Other animals are purposely mutilated, right? Birds are debeaked because they're put into such crowded situations. It's easier for industries to debeak them so that they won't peck at each other, but which makes it harder for them to eat, right? So there's, and this doesn't, again, say anything of the reproductive issues, of vaginal infections, let alone of their psychological health, right? So when I say that animals are manufactured to be disabled, what I'm saying is that these animals, the selective breeding for particular kinds of traits that are the traits that make animals profitable, are always going to be coming with impacts on these animal bodies in other ways, right? That these environments, on top of these conditions that are bred into their bodies, essentially, that these animals are also kept in with little room to move around, with no access to exercise. They're kept in cramped, filthy, and dark, essentially toxic environments, often immobile. Often they can't really move around. And so this, of course, also is going to be a space of disease and injury. And again, many animals won't even survive their short lives, but that's already kind of built into the profit margin. So we have this whole industry that produces animals for particular ends, and there's consequences on their bodies, is essentially what I'm saying. And there are, of course, certain kinds of conditions that the animal industries want to avoid, right? Certain birth abnormalities, such as, again, curly calf, are, they're destroyed, right? Or killed. The thing that I should say is sort of the most worrisome to these industries are contagious diseases, right? So even if one animal has some sort of maybe foot and mouth or something, that can lead to the culling, the killing of, just millions and millions of animals. And there's also, in another arena, it's kind of understood that one of the reasons why you shouldn't be abusive to animals, why employees are sort of directed to not abuse animals is, right, because it can damage the profits, because no one wants to eat bruised meat, right? So there's all these different ways in which disability and illness are emerging in these environments. But when you take all of them together, these are essentially disabled animals that are, again, being kind of purposefully bred and manufactured to be this way. But I also really want to point out that disablement in these environments does not only impact animals, right? The people who work in these environments, right, often low income people of color, immigrants, these are people who are put into who have to take these jobs, and they are profoundly dangerous jobs. It is well known that meat packing and slaughterhouses are some of the most dangerous and disabling jobs. There's a huge incidence of traumatic injury, but also just sort of the labor-intensive, repetitive motions that are involved in these factories. And then again, these are, often very people who are in vulnerable situations. And so when they do become disabled or injured, right, they are just quickly replaced and abandoned, right? Just essentially discarded too. So disablement, and there's also a very high incidence of human trauma working in these environments. So disablement is not something that that I'm only concerned about in terms of the animals, right? But we can also follow these trails even farther, right? These trails of disability, that the extraordinary amount of waste and pollution that emerge from factory farms, from giant lagoons of shit that contaminate our waterways, and then also the health impacts of a food system, right, that promotes and subsidizes these products, and then I know this is getting, very depressing and graphic, but I do just really want to point out too that it's not actually only the animals that we use for meat, right? We could look at animals used for, virtually any other industry and see that disablement is sort of part of the process of what kind of allows them to be transformed into objects, right? Into products. So we can look to fur farms, right? Who are bred, these animals too are bred for specific maybe coat patterns or colors that can be associated with a huge range of disabilities. But it's also animals in entertainment industries and zoos. There's actually like a multi-million-dollar industry that of animal pharmaceuticals, basically zoo animals on antidepressants and antipsychotics, right? Because so many animals in these closures experience mental illness in captivity, right? So, my point throughout this whole part of the book is that these industries profit off of the creation of multi-species human and non-human disablement. This is part of what they do. And so I see this as a site of kinship. It's a place where we should be able to connect the dots and follow the paths of injury to recognize just how awful, not only big meat is, but also countless other industries that again deal in this kind of disablement.
For our listeners, I do want to underscore how massive the industry you're talking about is, though. I think it's really important to just say that we, as human beings, raise and kill tens of billions of animals for food every year, right? I mean, it's, I think, important to name the scale. Livestock now make up 62% of mammalian biomass. So, this is not a fringe issue. It's something I think that you're getting at, and I just want us to spell it out with more care, is the connection between ableism as a system of oppression and speciesism, right? I feel like before we go further, I'd like us to just linger on that a bit.
Ableism functions on many different levels, but one thing that it does is it privileges and normalizes certain capacities over others, creates a hierarchy of value, and assigns some capacities with moral worth. These are capacities that one needs to be seen as having to be considered a person within certain philosophical and legal traditions. And I want to make sure that it's understood that these narratives of personhood and of the human too were forged in eras of profound white supremacy, misogyny, colonialism, and ableism, and still really also reek of these power relations. So what are these capacities? What am I talking about? So these are capacities that are viewed as prerequisites for personhood: language, rationality, autonomy, self-awareness. But these capacities, of course, not all of us have, right? These are ableist capacities. These are neurotypical capacities, right? They privilege certain kinds of capacities that are associated with neurotypical people and able-bodied people, but they are also fundamentally speciesist. They only privilege capacities that are said to be uniquely human. It's another whole other area of conversation that it is definitely up for a debate whether these capacities actually are uniquely human, right? All sorts of other non-human animals have these capacities as well. But for our purposes, that it is that historically in philosophical and scientific traditions, that it's these capacities that have made us uniquely human, right? So they are both at once ableist and they are speciesist. These capacities that make us human, are seen or that tell us that we are superior, are exceptional. This idea requires then that there are those who are outside of that, right? Who do not have these capacities, who it's okay to subjugate, which is, what we were talking about earlier. So this opens up all sorts of questions, right? What other kinds of capacities and ways of being are we unable to value because of this kind of ableist and speciesist obsession with these capacities? To some extent, I think in this era, it might be thought by a lot of people of like, oh, well, no, we no longer, think that animals are, just, machine-like automatons who don't have any of these capacities. We know that animals have, might have language or are emotional beings and stuff like that. But it's important to realize that that are, or consider that our relationships with animals as they are now were fundamentally forged with this understanding that animals don't have these capacities, and that's what justifies, in part, our domination over them, right? And so, I don't think our relationship to animals has not changed as we've kind of have new science that says like, oh, this species does, have, uses tools or has some sort of language or something like that, right? But that doesn't change the reality that this system of value fundamentally is still what upholds and justifies our hierarchical sort of structures and visions, right? That human beings are over here superior and exceptional, and thus can use all these other creatures, right?
Yeah, and this is, and I have a few thoughts. I mean, one is we're always moving the bar. So it's like animals have to prove they can use tools, and then multiple species do. Oh no, they have to prove something else, clear some other hurdle. And it's always meeting some human criteria as opposed to, I don't know, humans meeting the criteria of echolocation or something
exactly,
like that,
right?
I mean, we're in the center. And I mean, just to underscore what you said, they're overlapping, they're ableist and speciesist, this fetish for this, kind of very cliche idea of reason, of logic, and that these are the traits that we have to possess in order to meet this idealized standard of the human that, of course, is also raced, is classed, is gendered, all of these things, right? And this is important because it kind of sets up for the next question, which is going back to this fact that disabled people are reluctant to, or not all disabled people, obviously, but some disabled people are reluctant to embrace the idea of kinship with animals. And that's a loaded position, in part, as you've already mentioned, because of the utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer, who also upholds this, I don't know what else to call it, this kind of reason fetish, right? As we've acknowledged, his book, Animal Liberation, which was published in 1975, is really key. It's echoed in your book's subtitle. So talk about Singer a little bit more. We threatened to do this at the top.
Okay, I will do my best. So, just firstly, I'll say that Singer is a utilitarian philosopher. Again, he's kind of often kind of referred to as the father of animal rights for the work that he did, particularly with Animal Liberation, I think, 1975 book. But it's kind of funny because Singer actually didn't use the language of rights, right? What he is interested in as a utilitarian is minimizing suffering and creating the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? Essentially. Which hints immediately at why there's tension between disability, because if you understand disability as nothing more than suffering, nothing more than a bad experience that should be that is just bad, then you're going to kind of lead to some eugenic ends, and that's kind of where Singer has gone. So I will say also that so Animal Liberation, the vast majority of it actually was so powerful because what it did was it exposed what happens behind the closed doors of various animal industries. So there's sections on factory farms, there's sections on fur industries, right? But it was also this sort of philosophical exploration with why some beings are presumed to have moral value and some beings are not. Why we care about the suffering of some beings, right? And why we don't care about the suffering of other beings. And so what I appreciate about Singer, right, and I'll say this right off the bat, is that he doesn't see the category of the human as somehow just innately exceptional, or self-evident, that only human beings have value and should be protected from harm.
Right, this is what we like about him.
Right, this is what we like about him, right? And so Singer makes the case that there is not a single capacity that all humans have that all non-humans don't have, right? Whether we're all of these capacities that I love this rationality fetish, right? All of these capacities we've just been talking about, right? There's not a single one that you're like, oh, well, all human beings have this, So this is what justifies our superiority, whereas all non-human animals don't have this. But most often the human beings who don't have these capacities are disabled people, people with intellectual disabilities, maybe infants, right? Elderly people experiencing dementia. Right. So there's always going to be some people who don't have these particular capacities. And so again, he says, that we can't create a system of value based on those capacities. That instead, if we're trying to create a system of value or a system of equality, what he calls equal consideration, then we can't base it on any particular traits if we want to include all human beings. So ultimately, the only capacity that ends up really mattering for Singer is the capacity to suffer. That if a being has the capacity to suffer, then we should avoid causing suffering to that being. So if Singer had left his argument here, it would have actually been really remarkably anti-ableist. There's no capacities that are inherently what makes someone worthy, again, except, the capacity to suffer. But Singer didn't do this, because Singer, actually, like most people, was troubled by the fact that he still had this nagging feeling that it was, worse to kill a human being than worse to kill than to kill a chicken. One of these philosopher questions. It's like, well, what if I had to kill the human or the chicken? So he wanted to come up with a system that would make sense of the reasoning behind that, the justifications behind that. So then Singer returns to the capacities that he had earlier left behind. Again, rationality, self-perception, language, etc. And he uses these capacities to come up with two categories of beings, not human and animals, but persons and non-persons. So non-persons do not have these capacities, or maybe they don't have some of them. And so while we have a moral obligation to not cause them suffering, we do not necessarily have a moral obligation to not kill them, because they do not necessarily have the capacities that would make it wrong for them to be killed. Right? They don't have a sense of self, maybe. They don't have a sense of themselves through time. So killing them, if done painlessly, might not matter. Persons, on the other hand, so that's non-persons. Persons, on the other hand, are rational beings. They have a sense of themselves through time. All these capacities that would make, in this estimation, killing wrong. Here I actually think that a lot of people, are probably kind of agreeing with Singer's logic, right? But the problem is that, as Singer points out, and I say that many people might be agreeing with Singer because this is a common justification. For example, humane meat, right? That if it's done humanely, right, then maybe it's not wrong to kill animals, right? Which is something I think we'll get into later. But as Singer points out, not all human beings have these capacities, and the populations that he, again, most often points to are disabled, intellectually disabled folks, and infants. And so instead of kind of throwing out this system, and thinking, okay, that, this puts a whole population of historically very oppressed and dehumanized people at risk, maybe I need to come up with a new system. Instead of doing that, he just kind of doubles down on this and argues, really over the next half century, he's been doing this, that some disabled people are not persons, and that killing them under certain circumstances, potentially okay. And it's very subtle and very nuanced, but obviously it's pissed off a lot of disabled people for a lot of good reasons. And so, again, this argument may be extreme sounding, but it's actually, just like this fetish for these capacities, it's actually embedded in all sorts of arguments for continuing to eat animals by, those who, again, promote kind of humane meat. And so it does actually have effects, right? And of course, it lives on in arguments for animal rights, because on one level, he is saying, oh, being human isn't what matters. It's being a person. But to me, my response to all of this in this book is that rather than disability communities seeing this as proof that animal rights is at odds with disability movements. Instead, we need to look at this and realize that this is actually like profoundly speciesist. This is a profoundly speciesist argument. It does not protect animals either. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an argument that could be utilized by people like Michael Pollan or something, right? So it's both an ableist and a speciesist argument, right? Disabled human beings and non-human animals both lose out and have their lives and value gambled with. And, ultimately all this does is it rethrones rationality and all these other ridiculous capacities as, the arbiter of moral worth, right? So ultimately I just kind of say to hell with it. And I refuse to play this game where I'm pitting different populations against each other, in order to create a hierarchy of value. And in the book, I instead turn to other ways of thinking through animal and disability oppression. A lot of which we've talked about or we've touched on already, right? A politics of solidarity based on our shared exploitation, a feminist politics of care, a disability politics of interdependence. I'm reminded of one of my favorite sentences that we wrote together, right? Other species deserve not only our sympathy because they suffer, right? But our solidarity because they too are exploited and dispossessed.
Yeah, I think that nicely captures it. I mean, right? It's the shift, and suffering does matter. I mean, I think this is why there's a certain distance we go with Peter Singer. But ultimately, I think, a solidarity is a more interesting paradigm. I'm assuming that our listeners are pretty familiar with the critiques of factory farming, right? Animal industries are a prime driver of climate change, of mass extinction. We have 150 species vanishing daily. We're replacing wild creatures with billions of genetically similar beings, right? So you have these animal feedlots where you literally have sometimes hundreds of thousands of animals, which means that we are increasing the risk of future pandemics. We're seeing that right now with the headlines about avian flu. Of course, these animals are also fed tons of antibiotics, which creates risks of future antibiotic-resistant bacteria. I think people know a lot about this. But your book digs into humane meat, and I think has some interesting practical and philosophical critiques that I think it's worth spending some time on. And in a way, Peter Singer is implicated here, right? Because his emphasis on animal suffering has actually been an influence on this movement. I mean, it's important to distinguish animal welfare from animal rights. And we like animal welfare. We'd rather have animal welfare than nothing. But animal welfare is about mitigating suffering, right? Not about giving rights to creatures or shifting their status from property to persons. So, there's lots of problems. I mean, the humane label on the product you buy at Whole Foods really doesn't live up to the standard in lots of ways. There's so again, philosophically, you look at how speciesism and ableism are woven into both the industrial animal agricultural system, but also these smaller farms. There's a problem of scale that you talk about. What's the problem with humane meat, and why was it important for you to tackle it?
I think what you said, that fundamentally, these shifts don't actually do anything to alter the status of animals from property to beings we should respect and live with, right? So I think I automatically have a hard time with them in that, right? So there's all sorts of factors that I point to in the sections on humane meat that I won't get into too much here, but I think, there's the question of, scalability, for example, that often even on the best, the most humanely small farm, that as they kind of grow, become more successful, the pressures to end up, scaling up in these other ways end up reproducing the same kinds of systems of harm. There's also the fact that a lot of the same kinds of dynamics of, for example, reproductive exploitation are still, are present in these farms. So I take them to task in many ways, but fundamentally what I'm interested in is this shift of animals from no longer being seen as our property, right? As beings that we can just do with what we will. What happens, right, when we recognize that the cow is an emotional being, or if we recognize that animals are intelligent or have emotional lives, right? Like how are we then to justify their continued use and slaughter? This was a question that I was really interested in, because at this point, you're less likely to hear, I think, oh, well, we can use animals because they're dumb. That's not quite, that's not the argument that is used as much, right? Even though, again, I would say that argument actually does infiltrate all these other arguments still, right? That we have not sort of metabolized the new things that we've learned about non-human animals and had that alter our relations with them. So, as it has become sort of increasingly undeniable that animals are not just, automatons, right? I do think that arguments justifying, human hierarchy have had to become sort of more complicated or more sophisticated. And so one of the things that I wanted to do is I really wanted to look at literature, writing, arguments by the people the people and the farms who really do this as sort of well as one possibly can, right? So I'm not just looking at the factory farms that just call themselves, like small scale factory farms or something. Like I'm really interested in the people who are really doing small farming. What are their kinds of understandings and arguments around this? So I would say that these arguments have become more sophisticated, but they are still really steeped in all sorts of power relations and hierarchy. And so that's kind of what I'm wanting to turn to now. So I look at arguments for humane meat to better understand, again, this case that farmers and philosophers are making. And, so when they're not just falling back on this logic that suffering is wrong, but killing is okay, right, based on the sort of Peter Singer utilitarian framework we just talked about, then typically what these arguments almost always center are ideas of symbiosis or mutualism between species. In other words, they focus on the evolution of domestication and the sort of justification for the relationship that, as it stands now, sort of being rooted in this evolution of domestication. So the argument essentially, without, again, getting too much in the weeds, is that evolutionarily we have a contract with domesticated animals where we care for them in exchange for their flesh. There's, a sense that this was evolution. It's not coercion, right? That it wasn't just the humans fencing in animals and dominating them, that animals were active participants in this, right? So there's also this sense that animals are being given some agency. They were active participants in this process of domestication, right? So for me, what these arguments, are doing though is that they're really imagining themselves as being outside of power relations. Again, it's not coercion, it's evolution. It's all about biology and evolutionary history. Subjects that people making these arguments often, reiterate are not tarnished by human power. So, but for me, these arguments also look uncannily like Western traditions of the social contract, right? The idea that people of equal strength and independence came together to support each other and create society, and that's mutually beneficial. The argument here is that these animals have, through mutual benefit, become dependent on us for their very survival. So without us, they literally would not exist. So we would not be upholding our end of the contract if we did not breed and kill them. That is essentially the mutualism, that we breed and kill them but they exist. And so that is what they're getting in return.
As if being 62% of mammalian biomass is winning the evolutionary Olympics.
No, absolutely. And that's actually one of the things that doesn't make sense. Often these arguments will be like, oh, but we're not talking about, the billions of animals from factory farms, but you're also like, but that is what, when people say that domesticated animals are are evolutionarily successful. That is part of what they're pointing to. So it's kind of a contradiction. There's just so much wrong here, and from the fantasy, first, just the fantasy that these relations are outside of human power structures, right? And to me, the place where we can see this, I think the strongest, and perhaps this is my own disability lens, but is in the way the concept of dependency is used, the role that the concept of dependency plays. So, right, again and again, you see this narrative that domesticated animals are dependent on us for their survival, for their very existence, and that it is in exchange, us caring for them in return for their flesh. So dependency makes us seem benevolent. We are taking care of them while also being the justification for their further exploitation. And of course, it should be noted here that dependency has been used to justify some really horrific systems of domination, from slavery to patriarchy. So, in addition, dependency within this frame is, something solely negative, right? The fact that these animals are dependent then means that we have to get something in return. We're not just going to care for these creatures out of the goodness of our hearts. We need to get, this has to be an exchange. We have to get something in return. And so, but dependency, weirdly, it almost becomes this sort of like, it's almost this unnatural thing. And some of the literature here gets really strange, that dependent domesticated animals are framed as being unnatural, as kind of pathetic, as almost grotesque, right? That if human beings abandoned this role, that just, this sort of unnaturalness of all of these animals would just be sort of too much to bear. And you can see this especially in the difference between how wild animals are talked about as autonomous and independent in this kind of romantic way. And so I think, hopefully, after us talking through this interview, like, listeners will be able to see that from a disability perspective, these are really ableist conceptions of disability, right? And also disability has perpetually been used against disabled communities. And so to me, this whole schema is dripping with human power relations. It's anything but outside of human power relations. And various feminists and disability philosophers have long critiqued the social contract, right, for the ways in which it centers independence and autonomy and leaves out whole life experiences where dependency and care are not necessarily don't fit into this mutual, sort of frame in this traditional way. And then scholars have long looked at the issue of disability scholars, have long looked at the issue of dependency from the perspective of those being cared for, right? What is it to be, if you are someone who is dependent and you can't necessarily have an equal exchange, my care is maybe going to, I can't offer you an equal amount of exchange. What is a system of justice for that dynamic, right? From the perspective of the cared. And so that, for the cared for, and so that is the perspective that I kind of bring to this conversation, right? That this whole sort of idea that since animals are dependent, then that's a justification to then exploit them, and kill them. That is really part of this kind of very troubling ableist way of understanding dependency.
As you're getting at, idea of dependency is an ideologically loaded concept. It is also used to justify eroding the welfare state, because things like food stamps or public housing create dependency. And, if you are a conservative, that's something you've framed as so atrocious that, you'd rather starve people and leave them unhoused than provide basic social support. So, it's interesting how these concepts cross the species barrier. There's a really interesting article by the philosopher Nancy Fraser called A Genealogy of Dependency that I recommend people read. Okay, so the time has come. We've reached the next stage of our interview, so that we can build on some of what you're saying and connect it to our Lux magazine piece, which certainly wouldn't have existed without your book, Beasts of Burden. And so in this piece, we make an explicitly socialist feminist case for animal liberation. And I will just say that I was really, nervous publishing this piece, because, as we actually begin the essay, reflecting on the fact that people think animal rights advocates and vegans are just fucking annoying. I mean, and this isn't paranoia. I mean, there's research to back this up, that people really find us irritating. And so we wrote the essay with some trepidation, but I think it also felt like an important thing for us to discuss. And it's sad to me that people on the left and right are united by their hatred of vegans. And one point we make is that if being annoying was the sort of litmus test, then, we'd be like a very small cohort on the left, right? Sorry, a lot of us are annoying. That's just a fact. But so the essay is doing a kind of dance, and it's saying, hear us out, fellow socialists, because we think there's a robust anti-capitalist and also feminist case to be made for an animal rights position. We reflect on the fact that animal rights it's actually been called an orphan of the left, meaning that it is a progressive movement shunned by other progressive movements. There's kind of a lack of solidarity with the cause. And so what we want to do is kind of try to challenge that isolation and show how animal liberation is tied to other causes, other fights, just as you do for disability liberation and beasts of burden. And I think, this has been a sort of subtext of what you've been saying in this interview, but I think we're both really struck by the fact that socialists, who are generally very quick to question private property and the whole framework of property relations, rarely interrogate the ownership of animals. In fact, it's kind of naturalized, and, are relatively silent on the destructive consequences of animal industries. And so we think that that's something that should be challenged, or at least discussed, because these industries are massive. They're behemoths. They concentrate wealth and power. They abuse their workers. They're hurling us off an ecological cliff. They're slurping up government subsidies. And they're also exporting this meat-based diet to populations around the world, which is just going to intensify all the problems I just named. So, our point is that nobody, and I think this is fair, this is a $2 trillion industry globally. So nobody's eating meat in a vacuum in this situation. But to kick us off, why don't, let's linger on this idea that animal rights is an orphan of the left. Basically, my question is, what gives?
Yeah, what does give? I mentioned earlier that I noticed early on in my involvement in disability community, that was not an issue that the left was really interested in taking up, right?
That disability wasn't, you mean?
That disability was not an issue that the left was interested in taking up. And I don't know why that was. Like, is it because the ADA was passed by a Republican president? Is it because the 90s was just filled with like really awful sentimentalized stories of, disability that often had, religious overtones? Or was it the left's internalized ableism? And I think whatever the reason, there has been quite a dramatic change in the past decade or so, as disability communities have really forced open a conversation of the ways in which disability is like an integral aspect of social justice, right? And I think that there's a similar dynamic that is needed now in regards to animal issues, where we as animal people, need to say, like, enough is enough. We published this article and we're like, at risk of seeming like annoying vegans. We know that you like to mock us, but here are the reasons why this can no longer be an issue that is ignored. The stakes are just too freaking high for this to be seen as only a fringe issue of interest to a few weirdos, right? And so I think we really need to make this case. And I'm part of why I wrote Beasts of Burden, but definitely a central thrust of our piece for Lux. But okay, so that's my pitch for why this is an important case to be making. But to answer your question, I think that unfortunately, the mainstream animal rights movement has undoubtedly played a role in the isolation of animal rights from other social justice movements. And we write quite extensively about this, right? there are sadly real reasons why marginalized communities have sometimes perceived the animal rights movement with suspicion, right? I just laid them out in terms of why the disability community might, right? But there's also like a view articulated by many Black vegans and Black scholars and activists that white vegans care more about animal suffering than systemic racism, right? Then there's the, at times, misogynistic, ableist, racist campaigns produced by, groups like PETA. There's been the misguided targeting of cultural and hunting practices of minority and especially indigenous communities of some animal groups, animal rights groups. So there's all of these ways in which the animal rights movement has really itself kind of failed at times to expand the circle of concern, right? To reach out, to build, to bridge gaps, to build solidarity, and centrally to show why, again, these issues are connected and why systems, why, speciesism or anthropocentrism, whatever you want to say, is also entangled with all of these other dynamics that we care about, right? I will also say that I think, as suggested earlier, this focus on personal health has really been a political miscalculation. I think it's brought in a lot of people to some extent, but it's also done a lot of damage. I think many animal activists have kind of chosen to emphasize the physical benefits of vegetarianism in hopes that, targeting the stomach might offer some roundabout way to, getting to the mind, or changing people's minds, right? And, in one of the points that I really love in our piece is that we kind of think about this as an ongoing problem for the movement, because looking back at socialist writer Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, right, he which was a book that exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry, he reflected, that he aimed at the public's heart and by accident hit its stomach, which is essentially what just continuously keeps happening with the animal rights movement, right? And so I think there's been a kind of absolutely a focusing in on this, a doubling down on this, that appealing to people's vanity, right? Appealing to people's also fear of sickness, fear of disability, right? This idea that if only you go vegan, then somehow, you'll be live forever and be skinny, But this tactic has also contributed to veganism's image as the domain of privileged white people, right, who are not facing more urgent threats, which is in of itself kind of ridiculous, because the vast majority of the world's vegetarians are not white, and even within North America, white people actually are somewhat less likely to embrace vegetarianism than other groups, right? But the image that is promoted in, at least I would say, in sort of more traditional mainstream animal rights, media, and also just by the broader media of what the animal rights movement is one that focuses on this kind of narrative of veganism as a lifestyle, right, of health and fitness. And when I'm thinking about these issues, I always refer back to, Breeze Harper's amazing book, Sista Vegan, Black Women Speak on Food, Identity, Health, and Society. Because, Harper was really one of the first people that helped me kind of pinpoint what it was that I found so troubling about this kind of representation, right? And so she writes about how, these popular sort of mainstream vegan books, sort of relentlessly present racist, heteronormative, and ableist representations of what an ethical eater should look like, right? I think it's quite old now at this point, but this was sort of embodied by the book Skinny Bitch, which became a really popular best-selling book on veganism, that specifically addressed itself to white, affluent, and thin women. It was sold in airports and stuff like that. But it was also like a vegan manifesto, but it was through that lens, right?
Right. It was like, if you are vegan, you too can be a skinny bitch.
You too can be a skinny bitch, right? So I think also, veganism's association with beauty and wellness has also damaged its reputation by just reinforcing the idea that what we eat is merely a matter of personal preference, right? Going vegan is seen as yet another kind of lifestyle, as another just sort of offering on a crowded list of offerings, right? A crowded marketplace. So I think that all of that, but at the same time, I also would say that, the movement is not solely to blame, right? Also, the movement is represented in a particular way by the broader media and stuff. And this perception of what the movement is perpetually sort of reproduced. And so I think, we do a lot to unpack other kinds of histories, other kinds of movements in our piece of where animal movements have come from. And I think those don't get as much attention as the skinny bitches and the Peter Singers, right? So, but I also wanted to say that I think the left, maybe should take some responsibility here too, that there's also the left's own resistance to these issues, right? Which maybe aren't that different than the rest of society's resistance. There's an attachment to meat. There's an attachment to human exceptionalism. It's convenient to not have to figure out how to broaden, right, our already extremely strained idea of justice and, circle of concern to include animals. And there's veganism's, right, or animal movements association with the feminine, right? There's a tendency in our culture to pathologize a current concern for animals, which has been historically directly related to the fact that concern for animals is seen as weak and feminine. One of my favorite kind of little tidbits of historical information is that in the 1800s, there was even actually a diagnosis, zoophilpsychosis, which was the affliction of being overly concerned for animals, from which women were believed to disproportionately suffer. And I'm afraid, Astra, we certainly suffer from it. So I think that, right, we also should be looking at the way in which concern for animals has been pathologized, and why and by whom. And then I know I'm going on, but I'll just say also that I think that, we'd be really naive if we don't look and consider the fact that, the whole sort of conservative strategy of divide and conquer is at play here. I write in Beasts of Burden about a plan outlined by the American Medical Association in the late 1980s to capitalize on infighting with animal rights and to make it unappealing to other social justice movement. And this was happening at a time where there were all of these successes of, direct action, animal activists, really drawing attention to the cruelties that were happening in research labs. And they actually had a lot of support from different constituencies. And so, right, at this moment where there was sort of a lot of coalition and a lot of successes within the animal rights movement, then, the American Medical Association kind of comes back, to with a plan to fight this. And it literally states, right, that to defeat animal rights movements, one has to peel away the outermost layers of support and isolate the hardcore activists from the general public and shrink the size of the sympathizers. And I won't get into it here, but it ends up being a really fascinating story because they actually basically form a fake movement of disabled and ill people who want animal research to kind of go around the media and be interviewed about how important animal research is. But then an amazing group of disabled activists organize and go in and debate all these people and have a movement of their own. So, but I'm sure there's many cases like this, right? And the fact that animal issues are so isolated from the left is probably exactly what these big corporations want.
That is such a wild story. I just want to sit with it for a minute. I mean, it also makes me think about how in the early aughts, taking advantage of the war on terror, it was animal rights activists and environmental activists as well who were first deemed domestic terrorists, right? And sometimes convicted as such for literally doing nothing but engaging in free speech activities. But it was also this idea of sort of stigmatize, marginalize, alienate that that movement from other efforts. And so I think think it's exactly right to see this as part of a broader divide and conquer anti-solidarity strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I could actually just turn this question on you and ask why you think animals are an orphan of the left. And maybe even more importantly, like, why do you think it shouldn't be?
I mean, I think you hit on a lot of the things that we've come up with together. I mean, to underscore your point, where our side has fallen short, even though we're on both sides of this issue. I mean, I think it has been framed as an individual lifestyle you can purchase in the marketplace, and it has not been attuned enough to larger questions of political economy. And I think some leftists, what you often hear is, it doesn't matter what I do personally or how I eat personally, right? The problem is big corporations. The problem is that we need policy change. We need to restructure the economy, and I'm sympathetic to that critique, but also it's always struck me as a bit hollow because, I know through my own personal actions that I can't abolish misogyny, but I still try to live as a feminist. I know that I can't abolish racism, but I still try to act in an anti-racist way. And so I know my personal choices will not abolish the oppression of animals, but I still try to live my life in accordance with the values that I hold true and dear. So, but I think there's something deep going on there. Here again, Peter Singer has played a role because utilitarianism and its emphasis on suffering doesn't talk about political economy. It doesn't talk about the profit motive. But that reminds me actually of a conversation I actually had with Singer when we were filming Examine Life, because I pushed him on this issue. I pushed him on the lack of attention to political economy. And his rebuttal was that actually existing socialist and communist systems have not exactly been havens, let alone utopias for animals. And, he, in that moment, I was maybe 27 years old. I was like, okay, you're not wrong. I have to think about that. And, I think the position I've come to is that I actually really do believe we will not square a concern for animals within a capitalist paradigm that treats the world as, mere resources, mere product for human exploitation, but that we have a chance of doing so in a socialist paradigm. And that's sort of, what we're getting at in this Lux piece, which circles around a series of questions that I think it would be good to just read. We ask, what grounds our species' right to commodify and dispossess other sentient beings? What gives our species the right to violently exploit another animal's sexual and reproductive capacities in the service of capital? And I think these are really important questions. I mean, if you are, for example, a Christian, then you believe that we're justified because we have dominion over nature given to us by God. If you're a capitalist, you believe that everything is fodder for the maximization of profit. If you're one of these humane farmers that you mentioned, then you might buy into some version of this social contract myth that you discussed, right? That this dependence is the justification. And so one way of getting at what we're asking is, well, what's the story socialists or communists are telling themselves, right? Why is the commodification of other living beings okay? And I don't see, I just don't see an obvious justification. So one thing we do in the piece is look a little bit at Karl Marx. And, we were at a conference years ago. We were both there presenting, and we were really struck by something that the writer and editor Dylan Martindale said. And it's really stuck with me, I have to admit. He pointed out that Marx's most famous description of what communism might look like is actually a kind of vegan hell, right? Marx said that you could hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner.
No.
Right? And it's like, well, dude, what about like carpentry or like painting? Or could we do some science? Like, could we knit? Could we make soup? Like, no, we just have to kill animals and then argue with people. So...
Oh my God, that is a vegan hell.
But as we note in the piece, and other people have argued this at much greater length, Marx actually did have proto-ecological insights. And he wrote, and I'm going to quote this. He wrote in 1843, "The view of nature which has grown up under the regime of private property and of money is an actual contempt for and practical degradation of nature." End quote. So that implies that under socialism or communism, there would be a different attitude, a different ethos, right? Something other than contempt and degradation. And he also quoted Thomas Müntzer, who was this radical 16th century German minister, who said that all creatures have been made into property, the fish in the water, the birds in the air, the plants on the earth, all living things must also become free, which is a sentiment that we like. And so, I think there's sort of different histories to kind of draw on, right? As we've said, thoughts about animal liberation certainly did not begin with Peter Singer in the 1970s. There's actually much deeper traditions. A lot of early socialists were vegetarians. Movements for early movements for animal welfare were part of larger ecosystems of organizing in the 19th century, connected to abolition and the early women's suffrage movement. And so, part of what we want to do is recover some of that history and that interconnectedness. I think there's a lot of reasons why this shouldn't be an orphan of the left. I mean, part of it is, I guess, one thing worth going into is just that it's because you actually can't untangle what philosophers call the question of the animal from the history of capitalism. And so after we wrote this essay, one thing I realized, and I was kind of struck by the fact that I hadn't seen it anywhere else, and I included it in The Age of Insecurity, which is a book that came out last year, where I also write about these issues a bit, that actually livestock and animal exploitation are literally contained within the word capitalism itself, right? Like the Latin root term capitalis literally means of the head, and that is a reference to heads of cattle. So the etymology of the term capitalism literally implies that capital is made of animals, which is at least, partly true when you go back and look at this history, because the turn to the drive to turn animals into commodities and into profits was certainly central to the accumulation of North American wealth, right? Thinking about the beaver trade, for example, which literally built the first fortunes in what is, now the United States and Canada. And so, it's not a place to go into detail, but I just think that the hunger for animal products and the hunger for profits have been intertwined since the beginning of capitalism. I'm also here thinking about the history of the enclosure movement, right? And what was it that first drove enclosure in England? I mean, according to the 16th century philosopher Thomas More, it was sheep. And he's not the only one who says this, right? I mean, this is what the historical record says, is it was, wealthy landowners wanting to expand what was then an incredibly profitable wool industry. And so that was a driving economic force behind enclosure was the wool industry. And so, Thomas More complained that sheep were devouring men in villages, like just that this industry was exploding and dispossessing people. There's also research and work on the way that livestock was sort of conscripted into colonization in the New World, right? That when the process of enclosure came to what is now the United States, and how colonists sort of consciously used their animals to seize land, to replace the buffalo with cattle, and that they saw them as a kind of quote unquote like civilizing force. So so this is something that is there in the historical record, and I think is something that as leftists we should be paying attention to. And it's part of the this history sort of lives on, right, in our cultural assumptions and tropes. Like this process of colonization I just mentioned is part of why beef, like red meat, is seen as the American food, right? And why beef is an icon of sort of manhood and manifest destiny. And again, I just think that's something that we really, really need to be attuned to. So I think as people who are critical of capitalism, we need to have this kind of multi-species perspective. But we do something else, and I'll wrap up here, which is that it's not just thinking about the history of capitalism, but specifically bringing a feminist lens to it. So we draw on, in the Lux piece, we draw on the work of Silvia Federici, who's been a guest on the Dig before, and her book, Caliban on the Witch, and look at the enclosure movement's gender dimensions, right? And essentially what she talks about is how enclosure turned women into, these are her words, machines for the production of new workers, right? So family relations are sort of restructured to serve the needs of capital. Men are elevated as wage earners, whereas women are relegated to the domestic sphere. They're subordinate, they're dependent, to use a word we've been going back to. And so the enclosure movement, what she brings to this analysis that's so key is that the enclosure movement wasn't just about controlling land, but also about controlling bodies, and specifically about controlling their regenerative capacities. And this is what we argue really extends to animals. And, this is sort of the crux of this essay, which is, we're still kind of attached, even savvy folks are attached to this sort of false image of farms as bucolic places. This is really what the humane movement kind of plays into, right? But industrial animal agriculture is the antithesis of that. And I think we can actually only understand the horror of it when we view it through a feminist lens. And doing so was actually, writing this piece was actually really eye-opening for me. I felt like I learned things that I sort of knew, but I hadn't totally come to terms with. And so I'll hand it back to you here, right? Like, why is this feminist lens so important? I'll give a little bit away and just say that, when we're talking about there being billions and billions of cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens in the world today, the fact is, like, each of them came out of an egg or a vagina, because that's just how life works.
Yeah. And no, I mean, for me too, as someone who, has long been studying these issues, thinking about them specifically through the lens of reproduction, as we did when we were writing this, was just horrifying, actually,
Yeah, your challenge is now explaining some of it without causing everyone to flee.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, oh, I now I'm going to be talking about these realities. But I, really, first, I want to say though that it's like pretty amazing how, disturbingly Federici's analysis of the increased regulation of sexual and reproductive choices that emerged with capitalism fits with what happens to animals that we eat and exploit. It really, I'm really grateful for her for that work, because it's actually such a profoundly insightful lens through which to understand what is happening, in these food systems, what is officially known as commodity animal production. So, okay, so, as Astra, as you have kind of said, right, like, these animals have to come out of an egg or vagina. They are not magically dropped by storks, and so to have animals, you have to have a whole complex system of sexual and reproductive exploitation. And this stuff is gross, and we don't want listeners to turn this off, but, just think about it, right? How do cows and pigs become pregnant? Right. That is maybe one place to start, right? Like, let's start with artificial insemination, right? Which was a breakthrough, that became widespread after World War II, in order to improve the productivity of dairy cattle. And this breakthrough really made industrial animal agriculture more efficient, right? So today, thousands of low-wage laborers literally spend their days like forcibly inserting objects into female animals' genitals to impregnate them. That is their job. For cattle, this process involves technicians, again, low-paid, often immigrant workers, inserting an arm into a cow's anus to manually flatten like her cervix, prior to insertion of a so-called breeding gun. And so there's that aspect of it, and but then there's like the experience, right? There's the experience of the workers, right? There's the experience of the animals who are forced into these, you know, these sexual, exploitative dynamics. And then there's, the fact that then they are forced into pregnancy over and over and over again until they die, right? I mean, and this, again, can so easily be tied back into my own obsession of disablement. Like, what does that do to an animal's body to have to experience that over and over and over again? And it does a lot of damage, right? So, labor is, once it is time for an animal to be born, for, a pig or a calf to be born, labor is induced so that animals give birth, during regular working hours. So there's literally management up to the point of when animals are allowed to give birth, right? Everything is mechanized. Everything is sort of, has to happen within these parameters, has to be maximum efficiency, right? So, under the commodity system, the estrus cycles of entire barns of animals can be synced in a standardized process that yields, standardized results. And the amount of, again, I just want to reiterate this, the amount of exploited human labor and the amount of exploitation of non-human animals, to make this standardization process happen is just kind of mind-boggling. And there's all sorts of things that we won't get into here, but just like there's different hormones that are needed for these processes, right? We talk about, I'm trying to remember exactly the details, but we wrote about
there's like hormones that are actually taken from these blood mares that are in South American forests, these sort of quasi-wild horses or semi-wild horses that, are producing hormones that are essential to disciplining the biological clocks of pigs so that they can produce on the capitalist clock. But no, I mean, we're barely touching the surface here. But once you start looking, there's a lot of wild stuff happening.
It's important to bring up those kinds of dynamics because it's also all of these other kinds of animals or communities are factored into this exploitation that you wouldn't even think of, right? And I don't want to drag down or gross out listeners too much, but we haven't even gotten into what happens when then there are calves or piglets born, right? Or at that point, there's this other kind of real psychological, what I would just describe as torture that begins for these creatures, right? The forced separation from their young, cages and gestation crates, for sows specifically, that make it impossible for them to do anything to nuzzle their piglets who they might have, for a few hours, or to make a nest or to play with them, right? It is a complete immobilization so that the sow becomes simply just a reproducing machine, right? A reproduction machine. And then, just all of this emotional suffering is again also entangled with just all of this physical injury that emerges, like vaginal infections, increased susceptibility to disease, and just the horrors for dairy cows of udder infections, of mastitis, right? So these animals live in a sort of disabling dystopia of reproductive violence. Animals' capacities to grow and nurture their young are just reduced to mechanical processes, and for a mere
what Marx would call their species being.
Yeah, their species being, is utterly denied, right? And for chickens, it's the same, right? And factory farms, food production is a particularly egregious example, but this same dynamic of reproductive exploitation happens on the smallest of farms, right? Whether you're talking about a totally small, humanely run farm, all of these dynamics fundamentally still have to happen. You don't get milk without a baby being born. You don't have an animal to raise for meat without a baby being born, right? So all of these same dynamics happen even, on smaller farms. They also happen, right? Again, like in all of these other kinds of animal industries, right? Whether we're talking about fur farms or zoos, all of these places that exploit and essentially like have animals for the production of some sort of profit are exploiting the reproductive labor, particularly of female animals, right?
A lot of what struck me when writing this piece was the use of euphemisms, and euphemisms are everywhere. So, and they're especially used by the industry. So the industry talks of courtship, imitative, substitution of boar presence and behavior. So that's when an underpaid worker is actually sort of rubbing the back of a female pig. They call it stimulation. Of course, there's the phrase animal husbandry, which, my perception of that phrase really changed. And I think what I came to is that this is, industrial rape of animals. And that's just an inherent component of these processes because, as you said, you don't have cows to raise for slaughter without baby cows. And also cows do not spontaneously lactate. Babies have to be born. That's just a fact. And so, part of what we do in the piece is focus on milk, which gets less attention than meat in general. And I think it's actually sort of under thought about. It's actually much more interesting just on a sort of ideological and industrial level than I knew going into this. And even the phrase milk is really telling, right? Because it means both milk, the substance, right? This fluid that is secreted by female mammals to nourish their young, but it also is a verb that means to exploit for profit, right? To milk something for all it's worth. And we have genetically engineered cows so that they are worth a lot. So a dairy cow today is producing on average something like 2.5 times more milk than she would have 50 years ago. And as you said, this is, extremely damaging to her body. This is extremely hard on her body. And this is to use Federici's language, right? Turning bodies into machines. And why do we need so much of it? I mean, we don't have some inherent need to drink milk, human or bovine, throughout our lives, but there are all of these industrial subsidies that are propping up milk as an industry. And here again, this is a kind of post-World War II phenomenon. So industrial policy sort of encouraged farmers to produce a bunch of milk because they could make it so it was shelf stable and they could use it to feed soldiers overseas. And then they had this glut of it and they were like, what are we going to do with it? And the answer was, give it to school children. And so that has been the process ever since. And we've created a kind of whole mythology of milk, right? That it is necessary for strong bones. And when you go back and look at some of the propaganda, a lot of it was very ableist, very racist. This was propaganda during wartime. And at this point, this train has left the station. There was just actually a really fascinating piece in Vox called Big Milk Has Taken Over American Schools about just how intense the grip is of the milk industry on the diets of school children who, sometimes even have a hard time getting the information that they can have water as an alternative beverage. And so I think, it's important to acknowledge all of that and sort of denaturalize milk, right? Why its ubiquity is the product of these market forces and a kind of corporate capture. And that's part of what makes its status in the American imagination just so bizarre. And so one thing we write about is how milk has become a symbol for the far right in recent years, really, since the sort of rise of Trumpism. There's a period around 2016 where it was sort of a meme to bring milk to right-wing rallies. The phrase soy boy kind of came into popularity with the far right, right? Real men drink milk. I mean, we just sort of want to linger on the strangeness of this, right? Like, milk is for baby animals. How is it a symbol of sort of macho,
Yes.
heteronormative masculinity? And the fact is that, 65% of the world is estimated to be lactose intolerant. And in some countries, that number reaches 100%, right? Because most human beings stop, as you grow, you stop producing lactase, which is the enzyme that you need to digest milk. So after you're weaned, your body is like, I'm not going to be drinking milk anymore. I don't need lactase. So, this bizarre irony that the alt-right has turned the fact that thanks to a genetic mutation, a bunch of white adults have the stomach chemistry of babies into a symbol of their racial superiority and their hypermasculinity. It's just absolutely bizarre. And it underscores things we've been saying, which is there is a whole sort of politics of meat, a politics of milk that is sort of in the ether of our culture, and that we think needs to be deconstructed. Because it's, as you said before, it sort of reeks of these hierarchies that, I don't think leftists should really want to uphold. That all said, I think it's really important we not get too much on our high horse, right? And to go back to the trope of the annoying vegan, I mean, there's no position of sort of purity within the system as it exists. I mean, you can eat a diet of plants, but your food is still going to be manufactured within extremely harmful processes, processes that are damaging to the environment, that depend on exploited human labor. And so nobody is pure, and nobody is outside of capitalist relations. And I think that's just important to say. And one thing I think we settled on and we articulate in the piece is that for us, veganism is actually an act of imagination. It's aspirational. It's a political position and not just a dietary one. It's aspiring to a world where there is, yes, less suffering, but also more solidarity, and where that solidarity extends beyond the human. And, we acknowledge, right, that there's all sorts of complexities. We've taken issue, you took issue with, vegans who attack people in other communities, other cultures, people of other life ways for their farming practices. I mean, and I think you and I both object to that and think it's unstrategic. I think, some humility can go a long way too to building common cause with folks who might not be on our page 100%, but might see that we have, common adversaries. So for example, there's some proposed legislation that would ban factory farming by, I think it's 2040. All politics are messy, right? And maybe this is where we can wrap it up and go back to Beasts of Burden, because over the course of that book, you actually talk about the process of becoming vegan, and how you came to that position once you began to recognize the intersections of speciesism and ableism, right? So for you, that was really key, right? That epiphany. And for you, in addition to being aspirational, and now I agree with you, so for me too, but veganism is an anti-ableist position. So yeah, let's go back to Beasts of Burden and close with that. What is that epiphany, and what does it mean in your life?
Yeah. So, and just want to reiterate all the things that you said. I think it's so important to kind of push against this idea that vegans have a sense that they're, that they are outside of capitalism, right? Or outside of exploitation, right? Like all of the ways that we live are unfortunately so entangled with harm and just with messy histories, So I just really want to, reiterate and agree with you there. And not really that there's anywhere I disagree with you, because, we're just very much on the same page here. But I have to, maybe I'll have like a confessional moment though. And, it's always been, I joke that I had to write Bisa Burden out of a place of guilt because I was the last one of our siblings to become vegan. So you became vegan, how old were you?
When I was 12, yeah.
Do you remember? When you were 12, and then our brother Alex did a few years later, and then even our sister Nai, who's much younger, 10 years younger than me, became vegan many years before I did, and so it took me a while to get to this place, even after having all of the sort of epiphanies about animal cruelty and animal exploitation and stuff like that. And in the book,
you were vegetarian.
Oh, I was vegetarian. I became vegetarian at 6, but I didn't quite, even though rationally I understood, I didn't quite have it sort of internalized, just the extent to which, milk and eggs are profoundly exploitative and damaging in pretty much in the exact same ways as meat, right? In fact, now I think I would say that the animals who are, in many ways worst off are dairy cows and egg-laying hens. They're like not only killed and used for meat, but then they have these endless lives of production that is just really horrendous. And so, but I was actually really, I found it hard to become vegan. And I think that there were some issues of disability access in that it was hard for me to cook. It was hard for me to feed myself already. And this was like just another step that I had to figure out, right? How was I going to do that? And this experience has made me profoundly empathetic to people who are like, I can't do this. I don't have the means of doing this, whether it's like the health or physical access, right? Because I understand what that feeling is. But I went for lunch at some point with some disabled friends who I didn't know that well, who were vegan, and that was like this moment for me of through those conversations. I don't even remember specifically what we talked about, but it was a moment for me where I was like, okay, I need to figure out what actually are the barriers that I face, and the challenges that I face, and then what are just my attachments to not wanting to change these things because I like these products essentially, And so that in combination with really delving into the research of what actually happens to egg-laying hens, to dairy cows, right? And having this realization of the ways in which disability is implicated in it. Like for me, that really did. It's not that I didn't care about it before, but it was like it made me just internalize it in a different way. I don't know how else to say it, right? Like it just suddenly clicked of like, no, this is like, it was like one bit of information, like too much that I was like, okay, and then it was like, then after that, it was just like, I haven't looked back. It's not like I had a long struggling period of trying to be vegan, but not really being vegan. It was like that for me was what spoke to me essentially, and it's kind of funny on one level that like my transition into veganism was so much about food as it is for everyone's, but because for me, like veganism at this point, right, might be confusing to say, but it's almost just inadvertently about food for me, right? Veganism is a political position, as you've described, right? It's an anti-ableist, anti-anthropocentric, and anti-capitalist political and ethical position that I attempt to practice and embody in my daily life, right? I mean, so veganism to me, is like I care about animals. And as my sort of epiphany showed when I was like a little kid, right? Animals to me are not in the same category as food, right? Yet I am forced, as all vegans are, right? To perpetually talk about what we eat, about our diet. And this issue of diet then really becomes what people think that veganism is completely about. And, of course it is about that. Like, it's hard for me to even talk about this because, of course, it is about that because of the profound power and influence of, big meat and big dairy, and, not to mention we haven't even talked about like the exploitation of fish and other non-land creatures, right? But, we are forced to talk about food because that is what so many animals are commodified for within these industries, right? Billions and billions of animals, as you have said. But I think my point that, I'm kind of trying to get at is that veganism is not just about food. It is about opposing a system that turns life into things, that imagines all other living creatures as simply here for the benefit of human beings because we think we have some special capacities that make us superior, right? So veganism, for me, is an embodied practice that, to remind myself, essentially, that I refuse to be okay with that vision of the world. And it's a political position that takes justice for animals as integral to justice for disabled people and for all of us. It is about a way of challenging the commodification of life.
I think that's a really great note to end on. Sunaura Taylor, thanks for joining me on The Dig.
Astra, thank you so much for having me. It's always such a great pleasure to be able to talk through these questions about animals with you.
That was Astra Taylor interviewing Sunaura Taylor. Sunaura Taylor is a writer, artist, activist, and academic, the author of Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert, and Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation. She's professor in the Division of Society and Environment in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley, and director of the Disabled Ecologies Lab. Astra Taylor is a regular guest host here on The Dig, writer, filmmaker, and organizer who co-founded The Debt Collective, a union of debtors. She's the director of numerous documentaries, and her books include The Age of Insecurity, Coming Together as Things Fall Apart, Democracy May Not Exist, But We'll Miss It When It's Gone, and The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. Her most recent book is Solidarity, The Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea, co-written with Leah Hunt Hendricks. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the view of nature which has grown up under the regime of private property and of money is an actual contempt for and practical degradation of nature. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theo Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram at The Dig Radio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, also please leave us a glowing review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. So does telling people you know to check out this pod. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.